An old black woman was humiliated by two racist policemen, but the two policemen quickly turned pale when they found out who her son was. Please like and subscribe to follow interesting and meaningful stories. Mrs. Rosa Brown exhaled slowly, her hand steady as she reached for her phone. This wasn't her first time dealing with the indignities of prejudice. But at 75, she was too old and too tired for yet another humiliation at the hands of authority. She stared at the two officers in front of her, one young, cocky, with a gleam in his eye that spoke of misplaced power, the other grizzled and seasoned, wearing the look of someone who had done this before and enjoyed it far too much. The Deep South had taught her to recognize these men long before they ever stepped out of their cruiser. She had always believed in restraint, in dignity. The principles of nonviolence she had learned in the civil rights movement guided her every step. But standing there, under the hot sun, surrounded by these officers who saw her only as an old woman in a beat-up sedan, she felt a crack forming in the walls she had so carefully built. She wasn't just Rosa Brown anymore. She was a target. The younger officer barked again, impatient now. "I said step out of the vehicle." He emphasized each word as if speaking to someone hard of hearing. Mrs. Brown held his gaze, her silver curls catching the light as she raised herself from the driver's seat, moving deliberately. Her back straightened. With a firm, unshaking hand, she dialed a number she knew by heart. David answered on the first ring. "Mama?" His voice was deep, warm, a man who had built his life on the foundation she and his father had laid for him: justice, equality, respect. "David," she said, her voice steady, but lined with a tension she couldn't quite suppress. "I need you to listen to me carefully." The younger officer noticed the phone and strode toward her, his face hardening. "Put the phone down, ma'am," he snapped, stepping closer. Mrs. Brown didn't flinch. She locked eyes with him, the weight of decades of silent endurance reflected in her gaze. "They're going to search the car, David," she said quietly, her eyes never leaving the officer's. "Just be ready." There was a pause on the other end, a beat that stretched long enough for Mrs. Brown to hear the officer's footsteps shuffling behind her. Then David's voice came back, sharp and decisive. "I'm on my way." As she ended the call, the officers circled her car. They rifled through her things with the casual indifference of men who had never been held accountable. She stood to the side, her hands clasped, watching as they tore through her groceries, tossing aside her bread and fruit like trash. The younger one grinned at her from time to time, as if daring her to object. But Mrs. Brown remained still, calm. Her silence spoke louder than any words she could have uttered. Minutes passed, and just as the officers were finishing their farce of a search, a black SUV rolled up. David stepped out, his expression dark with quiet fury. He wore a crisp suit, his posture that of a man who had fought too hard and too long to let this go without a fight. The older officer, sensing the shift in the air, straightened up. The younger one, however, swaggered forward. "This your son, Granny?" he sneered, his smirk still plastered across his face. David didn't respond to the insult. Instead, he locked eyes with his mother, a silent understanding passing between them. "Officers," David said, his voice smooth but firm. "I'm here representing my mother." "Is there a problem?" The young officer blinked, thrown off by the formality of David's tone, but quickly regained his arrogance. "Routine stop, just making sure everything's in order." David nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "You're finished now, then?" The older officer stepped forward, suddenly unsure. We didn't find anything wrong." "Good," David said, his voice steely. "Because I'd hate to have to escalate this." He pulled out a badge from his coat, flashing it just long enough for them to register its significance. The older officer's face blanched. David wasn't just any public servant. He was a federal investigator, and from the look in his eyes, he had no intention of letting this slide. The younger officer opened his mouth to speak, but the older one cut him off. "Let's go," he muttered, grabbing his partner's arm. They retreated to their cruiser, the swagger drained from their steps. As they drove away, Mrs. Brown turned to her son, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I wasn't going to let them win, David," she said softly. David sighed, placing a hand on her shoulder. I know, Mama. But this time, we're not going to just walk away. And with that, a new chapter began. One where Rosa Brown and her son would no longer accept quiet indignities. One phone call had set in motion something far larger than a mere traffic stop, a reckoning that would ripple through the lives of those officers, through the small town and beyond. The line had been drawn. And this time, Rosa Brown wasn't stepping back. As Rosa Brown sat in her car, her heart still pounded in her chest. The sting of humiliation gnawed at her, mingling with the sharp ache in her tailbone where she'd hit the ground. The officers' mocking laughter echoed in her mind, their sneers more painful than the fall itself. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, trying to steady her trembling hands. The sight of them lounging by their patrol car, sipping sodas like nothing had happened, only deepened her sense of injustice. She glanced again at her phone, willing her son to call back. David had always been her rock, strong, dependable, and fiercely protective. He knew the world wasn't always kind to people like them, but this felt different. Rosa had lived her whole life with quiet dignity, enduring the small, insidious slights that came with being a black woman in a town like this. But today had crossed a line. It wasn't just the disrespect. It was the raw, unchecked cruelty in their eyes as they surrounded her on the ground, ready to pounce the moment she raised her voice. She had been nothing to them, just another target for their contempt. David's voice had been calm on the phone, but she knew her son well enough to hear the barely concealed anger beneath his words. "Stay there, Mom. I'll handle it," he had said, and she believed him. But what could he do? The fear crept back in, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. What if standing up to them made things worse? She stole another glance at the officers. The older one, Harris, was the more dangerous of the two, his reputation long tarnished by whispered accusations that never seemed to stick. His cold, emotionless face as she lay on the ground replayed in her mind. He had enjoyed it. She could see it in his eyes. The younger one, Miller, had tried to follow his lead, but there had been a flicker of hesitation when the family passed by. Something in him wasn't quite as hardened, not yet. But still, he had gone along with it, laughing at her pain, throwing the bread like it meant nothing. Rosa shivered despite the warm afternoon. This wasn't just about today. It was about everything that came before it. The unspoken rules, the fear passed down through generations, the constant awareness that a wrong move could ruin you. She had felt that weight her entire life, but for the first time, it felt like it was pressing down on her too hard to bear. The phone rang, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was David. "Mom, I'm on my way," he said, his voice firmer now. "Stay calm. I've already called someone." Rosa swallowed. "Called who, David?" "A lawyer," he said. "We're not letting this go. I'm going to make sure those officers know they messed with the wrong person." Her breath caught. She had never wanted to stir up trouble. But something had shifted inside her, a small but resolute flame sparking to life. The fear was still there, but now it was tempered by something stronger, a determination to not let this moment define her. Not this time. Minutes passed like hours as she waited, watching the officers from the corner of her eye. They seemed oblivious, lost in their own world of twisted camaraderie. Finally, headlights appeared in the distance, and she saw David's car approaching. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by tension as she saw him step out, his expression hard and unyielding. David didn't hesitate. He walked straight toward the officers, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the late afternoon sun. Rosa's heart pounded in her ears. She had seen her son stand up for what was right before, but never like this. Never against men like Harris and Miller. The officers noticed David as he approached, and their casual postures shifted. Harris sneered, stepping forward to meet him, while Miller hung back, his gaze flickering with unease. "Something you need, son?" Harris drawled, his tone thick with condescension. David didn't flinch. "I'm here for my mother. You think you can treat her like that and get away with it? Harris's grin widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. Your mother broke the law. We're just doing our job. David took another step forward, his voice low but steady. No, you're abusing your power, and now you're going to answer for it. For a moment, there was silence. Harris's grin faltered slightly, and Miller shifted uncomfortably behind him. Rosa watched from her car, her heart in her throat. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, she felt something stir inside her, a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the day something changed. Harris scoffed, shaking his head. Get out of here before you make things worse for yourself, boy. But David didn't move. He stood his ground, his gaze never wavering. We'll see about that. And with that, Rosa knew things would never be the same. Rose Brown hadn't expected her quiet afternoon to unravel like this. What started as a routine trip to the store had spiraled into something far more sinister when the police officers stopped her, their mocking smiles belying any sense of professionalism. They barely noticed the quiet phone call she'd made to her son, David, oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond their sight. Moments later, her phone buzzed. David's calm voice greeted her. I made some calls. Help is on the way. Just stay put for a bit longer, okay? Rose, still shaken, agreed, her gaze flickering to the officers who now seemed indifferent to her presence. 10 tense minutes passed. Then, without warning, a sleek black SUV pulled up behind Rose's car. Out stepped a man whose presence commanded the attention of everyone nearby. His tailored suit and poised demeanor gave away his importance before he even spoke. Approaching her window, he offered a polite smile. Mrs. Brown? He asked, his tone professional but warm. Rose nodded cautiously. I'm Kevin Coolidge, one of David's associates. He sent me to ensure you're all right. He extended his hand, and after a brief exchange, turned to the officers who were watching with curious expressions. Coolidge's approach to the officers was calm, yet assertive. Gentlemen, I'm representing Mrs. Brown's son, and he's deeply concerned about how you've treated her today. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing a shift in the air. Who exactly is her son? One of them asked, clearly irritated by the sudden presence of a lawyer. Coolidge didn't answer directly. Instead, he took out his phone, dialed a number, and spoke into the receiver, his words too low to hear. Hanging up, he turned to the officers again. You'll know soon enough. Almost as if on cue, another SUV, equally imposing, arrived. This time, the man who stepped out of it needed no introduction. Senator David Brown, a figure who commanded respect wherever he went, strode confidently toward his mother. His tailored suit and powerful stance were unmistakable. The officers' faces drained of color as the realization of who they had mistreated settled in. Mom, are you all right? David asked, his voice warm, yet there was an underlying tension. Rose nodded, grateful for her son's presence. The officers, now visibly shaken, stood frozen in place. David turned toward them, his eyes hardening. Officers, we need to have a serious conversation about your treatment of my mother. His voice was steady, but there was an edge that sent a chill through the air. The officers stammered, trying to explain themselves, but David cut them off sharply. Mocking and disrespecting an elderly woman is not something that can be excused. Did you or did you not cause her to fall and stand there without offering help? The silence that followed was damning. The officers, once arrogant and dismissive, now looked down in shame. They knew there was no excuse, no way to undo the damage done. David's gaze never wavered. Your behavior was unacceptable. This will not be swept under the rug. He gestured toward Kevin Coolidge, who stepped forward once more. There will be a full report, and I expect the footage from your body cams included. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air as the officers stood, pale and defeated, knowing their careers might be on the line. Turning back to his mother, David's voice softened. Let's get you home, Mom. You've been through enough today. As Rose took his arm, she glanced back at the officers one last time, their smugness now replaced with fear and regret. She couldn't help but feel a sense of justice, knowing they would face the consequences of their actions. As the black SUV pulled away and into her driveway, the tension that had gripped her all afternoon began to dissipate. David helped her out of the car, ensuring she was steady. "Thank you, David," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. She was safe now, but the events of the day lingered like a shadow. David gave her a reassuring smile. "Always, Mom. Always." David sat back, his eyes distant, replaying the events of the last few days. It was hard to believe how quickly things had spiraled out of control. The harassment his mother had endured, the public outrage, and the subsequent fall of officers, Harris and Miller had all unfolded in a whirlwind. Rosa, the woman who had always been his rock, now seemed smaller, more fragile, as she sat beside him on the porch. The quiet morning was a stark contrast to the chaos that had shaken their lives. "I don't know what I would have done without you today," Rosa murmured, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. David smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, a protective gesture that felt more necessary than ever. "You don't have to worry about anything. I'll always be here, Mom. Always." She leaned into him, taking comfort in his words. As they sat in silence, David's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his face hardening slightly as he made a quick call. "Mr. Coolidge," he said, his tone cool and composed. "Thank you again for your assistance. Please make sure the officers involved are held accountable." It was a simple statement, but the weight of it hung heavy in the air. The fallout from Rosa's incident had been swift, and the consequences were still reverberating through the town. News of a senator's mother being harassed by local police had spread like wildfire, igniting a firestorm of media coverage and public outrage. The once quiet town was now a battleground of opinions, protests, and calls for justice. The investigation into officers Harris and Miller had uncovered far more than anyone anticipated. What started as a single act of disrespect had exposed a festering culture of racism and abuse that stretched back years. Testimonies from black residents poured in, each story more damning than the last. The department had no choice but to act. Harris and Miller were placed on administrative leave, but it was clear that their careers were already over. The day of the disciplinary hearing arrived, and the tension was palpable. Harris, once brimming with confidence and arrogance, now looked pale and shaken. He'd always believed himself untouchable, a king in his small domain. But as he faced the panel, reality began to sink in. The charges against him were severe, and he knew there would be no escaping the consequences this time. Miller, who had always followed Harris's lead, was visibly distressed. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands trembling as the evidence was laid out. Years of misconduct, intimidation, and racial profiling had been meticulously documented. Their fates were sealed. The verdict was unanimous. Both were found guilty of gross misconduct, abuse of power, and civil rights violations. The punishment was swift and severe: immediate termination from the force and a recommendation to revoke their law enforcement certifications. The men who had once wielded their power with impunity were now powerless, stripped of the very identities they had built their lives around. Harris's reaction was one of cold fury. He muttered under his breath, his face flushed with rage. He couldn't believe it. After all these years of bending the rules, of operating above the law, it had all come crashing down. "They're making an example out of us," he growled, unable to accept that his actions had led to this moment. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was paying for a lifetime of wrongs. Miller, on the other hand, crumbled. He broke down during the hearing, tears streaming down his face as he apologized, though his regret was tinged with bitterness. Losing his job meant losing everything: the sense of authority, the respect he'd once commanded, the purpose that had defined him. He wasn't just losing a paycheck, he was losing himself. As the weeks passed, the town began to shift. The public outrage gave way to calls for reform, and changes within the police department were swiftly enacted. Policies were overhauled, training was restructured, and a new era of accountability took root. The downfall of Harris and Miller had sparked a movement, one that would ripple through the community for years to come. For David, the fight was personal. Sitting at the dinner table with his mother, he realized that this battle was far from over. "Mom, I've been thinking," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. I want to start a community program in your name, something that'll focus on respect, equality, and bringing people together. We can't just let this be a one-time thing. We need to make sure it never happens again." Rosa smiled, pride swelling in her chest. "I think that's a wonderful idea, David." As they discussed the details, the weight of the past days began to lift. They weren't just reacting anymore. They were building something new, something that could change the town for the better. The next morning, the air was crisp and clean, the kind of morning that promised new beginnings. David and Rosa sat on the porch, sipping their coffee and watching the world wake up around them. The story of Rosa Brown and her son wasn't just about a single incident of injustice. It was about resilience, about standing up for what's right, and about the power of one voice to create change. And as they sat there, quietly reflecting on the road ahead, they knew one thing for certain: the fight for justice was only just beginning.